The 100 billion euro retaliation file, Brussels strikes back. When news broke that the White House was seriously considering a sweeping 30% tariff on all imports, Washington may have expected pushback. But not like this. Deep inside the offices of the European Commission in Brussels, officials didn't waste time drafting a response. In fact, they were already prepared. Sitting on a table in a closed-door room was a thick file marked No Deal Contingency Package 100 Billion Trade Rebalancing Blueprint. This wasn't just paperwork, it was a ready-to-go retaliation plan calculated down to the last euro. The number on the cover, 100 billion euros, wasn't a rough estimate. It was a precise bill for the economic damage Brussels expected from a 30% American tariff wall. The idea behind it? Simple. If the United States punches first, the EU punches back, with equal force. And the blow wouldn't just target trade. It would hit jobs, voters, and political pressure points across the American economy. From Boeing's wide-body jets to Iowa's soybeans to Silicon Valley's App Store commissions, this plan was a guided missile aimed straight at Washington's domestic politics. This wasn't just trade policy, it was strategy, it was messaging, and it was personal. The moment the Atlantic wind shifted, Europe on red alert. It all started in mid-July. Word began spreading across Brussels that the White House was not bluffing. A 30% general tariff, once seen as a negotiating threat, was now being prepared as official U.S. policy. Inside the red-roofed government buildings of the European quarter, alarm bells went off. For EU leaders, this wasn't just another trade scuffle. This was a seismic shift in transatlantic relations. A tariff of that scale would shake the foundations of European industry, digital trade, and agriculture. It would hit European factories, cloud servers, and farm exports all at once. More importantly, it would undermine the long-standing assumption that Washington and Brussels, despite disagreements, shared basic economic rules. That's when the thick file came off the shelf. Titled plainly as a rebalancing blueprint, it had one job: to show that if the U.S. raises the wall, Europe can build one of its own. The moment the Atlantic wind changed, Brussels didn't panic. It opened the file and began converting it into policy, quietly, methodically, and with full legal authority. This wasn't improvisation. It was a pre-calculated economic counterstrike, ready to go live. The contents of the retaliation file: a weaponized tariff map. The retaliation file wasn't a vague threat. It was a fully loaded spreadsheet of economic pressure points. Every number, every sector, every product code was selected with precision. Brussels wasn't aiming to match the U.S. tariff move just in size. It wanted to match it in impact. The file broke the 100 billion euro retaliation into two main parts: 66 billion euros in industrial tariffs and 34 billion euros in digital and agricultural taxes. Let's start with industry. The plan earmarked 10 billion euros just for aircraft parts, fuselages, engines, avionics, clearly aimed at Boeing. 28 billion euros for automobiles, Detroit SUVs, Kentucky pickup bodies, Ohio-built electric motors. The rest was spread across medical devices, petrochemicals, semiconductors, and plastic-based goods. Then came the 34 billion euro wedge, Europe's version of a digital and agri-tax bombshell. It introduced new taxes on cloud hosting licenses from U.S. tech giants, streaming platforms like Netflix, and App Store revenues from Apple and Google. Plus, tariffs on corn, soybeans, beef, and dairy, products closely tied to Midwestern U.S. states with political sway. But here's the clever part. Brussels wasn't just going after dollar signs. It was going after domestic vulnerabilities. Each tariff line was a pressure point aimed at triggering calls from American voters, CEOs, and lobbyists. This file wasn't about trade fairness. It was about changing Washington's political calculus. The Boeing effect and Detroit's dilemma. Where it hurts most. The first sector on Brussels' target list wasn't chosen by accident. It was aviation. Specifically Boeing, the pride of the U.S. aerospace industry. Every year, Boeing ships around 150 to 160 wide-body aircraft to European buyers. But these planes aren't just metal shells. They represent a massive web of American jobs, with over 200,000 workers tied to each aircraft's supply chain. A 25 to 30% tariff on these planes would immediately disrupt that chain. Brussels knew the impact would stretch far beyond Seattle. The ripple would hit Spirit Aerosystems in Kansas, which builds wing boxes, titanium casting plants in Connecticut, and avionics software teams in Arizona. And while Boeing stumbles, Airbus rises. With tariffs pushing European buyers away from American jets, Airbus factories in Toulouse and Hamburg gain momentum. Slot shortages disappear. The EU's Clean Sky Fund, its green aviation initiative, gets a boost. And suddenly, Europe doesn't just retaliate, it wins ground in aerospace. The same logic applies to Detroit. EU consumers buying SUVs or pickups made in Kentucky or Michigan will now face 30% more at the dealership. Even worse, Europe's carbon border adjustment mechanism is coming in 2026. That means fossil fuel-heavy American vehicles will face extra costs just for their emissions footprint. So while Ford and GM stocks fell, Volkswagen, BMW, and Mercedes gained. This isn't just a tax fight, it's a market shift, and it's happening in real time. Digital justice or economic war? Silicon Valley and the Crosshairs. After striking at planes and pickups, Brussels turned its sights on the cloud, Silicon Valley. The retaliation file included something Washington has long tried to avoid: direct taxes on United States tech giants operating in Europe. The EU laid out a new three-tier digital tax structure, carefully calibrated to sting 6% tax on Google's advertising revenue, 5% tax on Apple's in-app purchase commissions, and 7% tax on Netflix subscription income across Europe. At first glance, these numbers might seem small, but when you consider that United States tech firms make over 100 billion euros in annual revenue across the EU, the impact becomes clear and expensive. We're talking about billions in new costs for companies built on high margins and scale. But this move wasn't just about money, it was about control. The EU is challenging the United States monopoly on digital infrastructure, and it's doing so by rewriting the rules. One of the biggest shifts, a push for data localization. That means platforms like Amazon, AWS, Google Cloud, and Apple iCloud may now be required to store European users' data inside the EU on local servers. Washington cried foul, arguing the EU is breaking WTO digital trade rules. But Brussels responded with a clever legal shield, the doctrine of comparable harm. If one side disrupts trade through tariffs, the other side can respond with equivalent impact, even outside traditional categories. And the political pressure is growing fast. California senators are already fielding calls from tech lobbyists, but Europe isn't backing down. For Brussels, this isn't just retaliation, it's the start of a long overdue digital reckoning. Escalation by design. The EU's rebalancing ladder. Unlike Washington's one-size-fits-all tariff wall, Brussels built its retaliation plan to scale, automatically. It's called the rebalancing ladder. At each rung, the EU increases pressure to match Washington's moves. Euro for dollar, blow for blow. Here's how it works. If the United States imposes a 30% tariff, the EU unleashes its full 100 billion euro package. If Trump pushes it further, to 35%, Brussels hikes its response even higher. At 40%, the EU activates its ceiling 105 billion euros in retaliatory duties and digital penalties. It's not random. The EU attached automatic escalation clauses to hundreds of product categories, from steel components made in Pittsburgh to cloud licenses sold in Berlin. If tariffs go up, so do the countermeasures. No need for another vote. There's one exception: defense and national security goods. Items like Patriot missile systems and NATO standard ammunition were left deliberately blank in the tariff list. Why? Because Brussels wants to keep the Pentagon-NATO supply chain as a bargaining chip. That's where Washington is most sensitive, and where Europe holds real leverage. The numbers aren't just theoretical either. EU economists project that the direct hit to United States GDP would be 0.35% if the full package is triggered, with indirect effects, like weakened investor confidence and currency volatility, raising the total to 0.6%. And for everyday Americans, that translates to something very tangible: an average $470 tax increase per household. Brussels didn't build a wall of tariffs, it built a ladder of pressure. And Washington is now staring up at it. Who pays the price? The consumer's shock. For most Americans, trade wars feel distant until the costs show up at checkout. And Brussels knows this. The retaliation file was carefully designed to strike not just industry leaders, but ordinary consumers in ways they'll notice immediately. Take groceries. If the EU fires back, the price of European cheese, wine, and specialty foods could jump by 40 to 70% in United States stores. And then there's gas. If the trade war weakens the United States dollar, as expected, the cost of imported oil rises. That means higher prices at the pump, especially in car-dependent states like Iowa and Texas. On the jobs front, canceled Boeing orders from Europe would hit workers across multiple states. Even digital life takes a hit. Subscription services like Netflix and Apple Music could pass on new European taxes to American customers. And if the EU forces data to stay inside Europe, tech companies will raise prices to offset new compliance costs. In other words, the economic pain won't just be numbers in a report. It will be felt in the fridge, at the pump, in the paycheck, and on the phone bill. This is exactly the kind of voter unrest that election year politicians fear the most, and Brussels knows it. The countdown has begun, a cold trade war in the making. As summer turns to fall, the EU isn't rushing, but it's not backing down either. The retaliation package is moving through final stages. July, draft complete. August, legal articles finalized. September, council review. October, possible approval and activation. Behind the scenes, NATO and G7 allies are watching closely. Brussels is documenting every legal step to prove that when Trump's 30% tariff wall goes live, the EU is ready to strike back within seconds. It's not just economic preparation, it's political messaging. But this is more than a tit for tat. What's taking shape is a new kind of cold trade war, not fought with weapons, but with tariffs, digital taxes, and carbon penalties. Europe's retaliation isn't only meant to punish, it's designed to reshape global supply chains. Airbus wins contracts that once belonged to Boeing. Detroit SUVs are rerouted to Latin American markets. Silicon Valley tax codes are rewritten in Brussels, not Washington. And while Trump may frame the tariff wall as strength, he risks triggering a chain reaction that weakens consumer power, inflates prices, and erodes United States influence abroad. For Europe, the 100 billion retaliation file isn't just a number, it's a geopolitical tool, one powerful enough to shift voter behavior, currency flows, and military alliances. The final words in Brussels' playbook are chilling. If the other side cannot be deterred, we have no intention of leaving anything half done. The countdown has begun, and if diplomacy fails, the first economic bombs will fall not on distant battlefields, but on digital clouds, airport tarmacs, and Midwest farms. What do you think? Is this just brinkmanship or the beginning of something bigger? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the future of global trade. Thanks for watching.